right. Good morning, everyone. Cool. Well, thanks so much for being here. So I'm going to talk about a topic that I'm very excited about, very interested in. So it's Urbit, and we're going to talk a little bit about, the history of Urbit, the vision of Urbit, technically how Urbit works, and also a bit the relevance of Urbit for Web3. So yeah, so just a few things about myself. So I've been working in crypto for pretty much exactly 10 years now. Mainly, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Course One. So we're one of the leading staking providers with, about $1 billion in assets, staking on around 50 different networks. I was previously COO of Tendermint, so back in 2017. So Tendermint, the kind of company that started the Cosmos ecosystem. And I'm also on the board of the Interchain Foundation, so kind of the Cosmos Foundation. And I've been running a podcast called Epicenter for a long time. It's the longest running crypto podcast at this point. We just did episode 500 recently. And that's also where I first got into Urbit. So I did an Urbit episode in 2017, and I've been kind of aware of it since then, although I've gotten much more involved in the last few years. And I'm also recently now a board member of the Urbit Foundation. But yeah, with that, let's get into Urbit. So I'm curious, first of all, of the people here in the room, who here feels they have an understanding of how Urbit is, or what it's trying to do? Okay, cool. So lots of people, relative to the size of the audience, lots of people, not so much. And I guess who is actually on the network and has the Urbit ID and is using Urbit? Okay, cool. About the same group. Okay, great. So explaining Urbit is something that people struggle with a lot, because Urbit is this vast project with that's weird, complex, and and a lot of people are like, what is this thing? So I think one good way that I find of explaining Urbit is sort of think of Urbit as the answer, and then ask what is the question that Urbit is trying to answer. And I think the sort of question that Urbit is trying to answer arises from basically looking at how people use computers today and how the internet works, and then and sort of this, I think, almost an aesthetic sense that it's kind of a complex mess, that you have all of these old protocols and they're layered on top of each other, and it involves in this huge stack that's very complex, and sort of asking the question of what would it look like if you just started from scratch, if you just threw it all away and tried to build a computing system that sort of corresponds to what people want. So that's basically kind of the question that was asked. And so let's talk a little bit about Urbit history, because Urbit history is also very unusual and weird. I think it's it's sort of on par with Bitcoin's weirdness almost. So for one, it's very old. So Urbit project is now over 20 years old, and it was basically started by some guy named Curtis Yarvin. So he had basically made a bunch of money working as a developer in San Francisco, and then he didn't have to work anymore, and so then he was like, okay, what am I going to do? And so he started asking that question and thinking about, okay, what would such a computing stack look like? And for 10 years, he was working on this by himself as the sort of sole person research project. One of the things that came out of this computing stack, for example, is the kind of Urbit assembly language, the machine language. And it's super concise, and he spent 4 years on that. And it resulted in 32 lines of code, sort of. So it's now in 2013, he actually managed to, he started a company with some others, and they raised some funding. And actually, there started to be a team that actually started to build this out. And for a long time, it was just one company for many years building this software stack. And then, in recent years, it's really accelerated. So 2021, you started having software distribution. So people started to be able to write apps on the Urbit platform. And then 2022, we started getting kind of involved at Course One, so we started a team and to run Urbit infrastructure called Red Horizon. And today where we're at is there are probably about 10 companies in the Urbit ecosystem that have raised some funding from investors. There are about 80 sort of monthly active developers that like primarily working on Urbit. There's, I would say there's about 9,000 chips that are active, so we'll talk about what that means, or servers that are active on the network. So it's become a pretty vibrant ecosystem, super interesting and smart people in there. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what is the Urbit vision. So if Urbit actually succeeds, what does it look like? At the core of Urbit's vision is the idea of personal servers. So if you look at today and how the internet works, then the cloud is sort of the dominant paradigm, right? So there's Facebook, Google, etc. They run a bunch of applications. I'm a user of those applications. So the applications run on servers controlled by Google or Facebook. My data is there, and my data and applications are then kind of scattered across different servers operated by different cloud companies. Right? That's sort of the status quo. In the Urbit world, in the Urbit vision, there's this idea of a personal server. So there's this idea that there is a server that kind of is mine, belongs to me, and all of my data is on that server. It's a sort of digital home for me. And the applications I use are also on that server. So when it comes to software, it means it works more like back in the day, right? When you went to a computer store, you bought a CD, took it, put it in your computer, and then it was running there, right? Except, you don't have the physical CD. You can distribute the software digitally, but it kind of like that. Now, it can still be sort of a cloud-like thing, right? That let's say I have a mobile application, it uses API, it talks to the server, except that server would be my server, not like someone else's server. So that's kind of like the high level, the architecture that Urbit envisions in the long run. Or, I mean, it works like that today. It's just, I guess the use cases it covers is still pretty limited. So you can describe Urbit as an operating system, a new operating system for operating or powering personal servers. So let's go a little bit more technical here and explain how this works. So Urbit runs, so it's an operating system, but today it runs as an overlay operating system. So it's running on top of existing operating system like Linux. In the future, you could have Urbit run directly on hardware. So you could do like Urbit chips. There's I think some designs for that, but probably many years until that actually becomes a sensible thing to do. Urbit also has this vision that the OS, the operating system, should be very minimal and a sort of permanent standard. And I'm going to talk more about that. I think this is one of the most important ideas in Urbit. Urbit is also fully functional and deterministic. So it means that you have the state of your operating system, there's an event, and then it updates the state, and that's a new state. And so the entire state of each Urbit server is just a number. And of course, that's very analogous, right, to how blockchains work. And sometimes even Urbit has been sort of described as, it's kind of like this personal blockchain. And then there are some things also that are part of the operating system that today they're not part of any other operating system, right? So they're part of things people build on top. But things like networking, messaging, and identity are part of the operating system. So they're sort of primitives that you can use when you build on top of Urbit. So let's talk about this idea of minimalism and permanence. So the idea for Urbit is really to build an operating system that's as minimal as it can be and that will get to the point where it never has to change. So that you'll be able to run software today and you'll be able to run that same software 50, 100 years from now because the core operating system's the same. So one thing that sort of I think showcases that is the idea of Kelvin versioning. So normally in software, right, you increment, right? You go from 0.1, 0.2, 1.0 release, things like that. In Urbit, all of the core software stack has this thing called Kelvin versioning, where the software versions are decremented. And then if you get to 0, it is done. You can never change it anymore. So that kind of expresses this idea, and it's also a good example of why Urbit seems very weird, because Urbit, like I think a lot of things in Urbit are basically this first principles reasonings of how it should work, ignoring how other people are doing it. So there are all these things that are like they don't look like the existing software conventions. And also, I mean, it shouldn't become zero maintenance. It's not quite there yet, but it's reasonably close. So that will basically be like, okay, you have this thing running, and it doesn't need upgrades. It just runs, right, without any issues. And I think that one of the benefits would be that, okay, you have this stable and trust minimized foundation that you can just build on, right? It's very different from today if you're building on, I don't know, Mac OS or something else where it's always changing, it's in control of somebody else, and it's complex, it's hard to understand. So another thing is, I mentioned identity, right? So the identity system is part of the operating system. So Urbit is not just an operating system, it's also a peer-to-peer network. And at the core of this peer-to-peer network is the identity system. So every Urbit server, whenever it's booted up, it has an identity. And that identity, it's basically just some number, but it's also a number that's, and so the standard identity is called the planet. And that's what a normal user will have. My personal server, will be a planet. And they're also human pronounceable. So for example, mine is called Minwijk Dablon. And in the Urbit community, if you go to Urbit conference, many people will just use that as like, that's who I am, right? That's the kind of their identity. It really becomes their identity. And of course, if somebody else knows my name, that they can just communicate. Any Urbit server can communicate with each other using that identity and using the peer-to-peer system. You can also think of this Urbit ID as a sort of lifetime license for the Urbit operating system. As long as you have that Urbit ID, you are part of this Urbit network. You will receive all of the upgrades, right, for the operating system that happen. And the identity are scarce assets, right? So they are cryptographically scarce assets. For example, for the planets, there's 4.3 billion at most, right? And then there's some other types of ID that are either cheaper, more disposable, ephemeral, or more expensive, that they have more and more scarce because they have different functions in the network. And these identities are managed on Ethereum and an Urbit native L2. So that's basically the only direct blockchain component. Although I think Urbit and blockchain are very much going to merge, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about sort of Web3 and Urbit. So one of the best, I think, critiques of Web3 was in this article by Moxie Marlinspike. And has anybody read it here? Okay, not so many. So he is the well-known cryptographer. He's the guy who created the Signal app as well. And so he was basically saying, okay, let me check out this Web3 thing, and does it make sense? How does it work? And so he also built some, kind of example applications. And and he was basically like, this thing doesn't make any sense, because when you look at these Web3 applications, that they still rely on basically other people's servers, and there's a lot of trust there. So for example, if you have a Ethereum dApp, you rely on Infura to give you data from the chain, and you have to trust that. Or he made this example where he built an NFT, and he did something that the NFT changed sort of as as he did something. He sold it on OpenSea, and he even indicated, okay, the NFT is going to change. And then OpenSea was basically like, oh, can't have NFT change. So they basically unlisted it from OpenSea. And then it disappeared from all the wallets too, because the wallets were using OpenSea's API to show the NFT. So even though it still existed on the blockchain, it was actually relying on this central API. And then, so in the Urbit world, of course, applications function very differently, because the application runs on each user server. I think there's a lot of benefits. And one, I think, illustration of that is, so there's like an Urbit developer, AJ Lamarck or Larix Waldeyer, who built a sort of, this is like a weekend thing, right? But he basically built a Uniswap, the Uniswap on Urbit, right? So it would be like, okay, you can download this Uniswap application, and so I can like demo it briefly. So also this is here basically sort of, the primary user interface at the moment that's used for Urbit. So you can see like terminal, this is basically just like the terminal on your computer, right? Where you can like talk with the computer. Talk is a kind of messaging application where you can speak with other Urbit users. Groups is kind of like, I think what Urbit is most used today is something like Discord-like thing. So groups basically allow you to organize groups for different people. And then, so yeah, let's see this briefly. So you see here, he's basically downloading the application. The application is hosted on a particular server. So now he's clicking on Uniswap, get the Uniswap application. Now it's being downloaded on his server. So he's opening, and this is now running, right, locally, it's running on his personal server, and now, he's making a trade, and yeah, and exchanging some coins. So, of course, when you think of Web3, right, one of the key points where people have tried to control decentralized application in Web3 is actually through things like front-end, right? So let's say if you're in Iran and you want to go on the Uniswap front-end, they're probably, they're going to block you, right? Because they're like, okay, we're a US company, US has sanctions, Iran, right? So we cannot allow that. Or, they may be delist certain tokens, so, Tornado Cash disappears, like all kinds of stuff like that. And of course, it's also a centralization thing, right? Because now you are relying on that Uniswap team to maintain those servers, run that thing. They can track data, right? Maybe where the IP addresses come from, who's doing what. And of course, it's also a regulatory risk for those companies by basically running their applications, because they're not actually just writing the smart contracts, right? They are also hosting those applications. So Urbit has like a very different architecture that I think is extremely well suited for Web3 applications. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's actually happening on Urbit. Like, what are people building? I think that will give a little bit of an idea of what's going on and the direction it's going in. So first of all, Clone. So I mentioned Clone before. Clone was basically the first Urbit company, and they're still going. And Clone is doing a bunch of different things. So one is that they're doing this thing called Landscape. Landscape is basically the graphical interface for Urbit. So you can see here, this is this interface for Urbit. You access it through a web browser at the moment. These are different Urbit applications. And that's kind of like the main way people are sort of using Urbit. For me, I was interested in Urbit for years before this existed, but it seemed very abstract. But once Landscape came out and I started being able to use it, I'm like, okay, actually, I can interact with this in a way, and it started feeling like a concrete thing. So this is developed by Clone. And then Clone also has, for example, a smartphone, iOS and Android application. Like this, where you can basically get talk and groups. So you can message with people, and you can set up groups and stuff like that. So this is very widely used. In the Urbit community, really, they use Urbit a lot. Clone is primarily, they run their entire company on Urbit itself. And they also work on hosting, so working on infrastructure for Urbit, kind of like we do as well. So that's Clone. And another project that's very interesting is called Uqbar. Uqbar is basically trying to really bring this world of Urbit and the world of blockchain together. And they are doing that by building an Ethereum rollup, an L2, but that's running on Urbit. So, for example, the smart contracts on Uqbar are written in Hoon, and Hoon is the native programming language for Urbit. So you have the kind of machine language I mentioned before, Nock, and then you have a higher level language, Hoon, which is the main language Urbit is written in, the language that Urbit apps are written in. And so you can basically then write this Urbit application, and you can also write the smart contracts, in the same language, in the same development environment. So it also means if you write an Urbit application, right, you have the ability to use these smart contract features, but you also have, when you're writing that application, you know, access to an entire operating system, a file system, local state, those kind of things, right? Which you don't really have, right, when you write a Web3 application today. So I think, you know, so this is very interesting. I think this combination of, you know, private state and blockchain. I think if you think of Urbit application, probably what will happen, at least in the expectation of people in Urbit, and my expectation is that actually the role of blockchain would decrease and more things would just happen locally in people's applications. But of course, you still need blockchain, right? You still need, you know, if you want to make any kind of, you know, let's say financial transfer, you need some kind of consensus. It's still there, and Uqbar is working on making that super smooth. Uqbar is also leveraging ZK technology. And so the interesting thing about Urbit, and this is kind of an accidental thing, it wasn't planned like that, is that Urbit is super well suited for ZK proofs. So you can do ZK proofs for basically any arbitrary Urbit computation very easily. There's another company called Zorp, which is working on that, basically ZK provers for, you know, arbitrary Urbit code. So this is very cool, right? Because you could have like, in some Urbit application locally, something happens, ZK proofs being submitted, or do ZK proofs for, you know, all this stuff. So Uqbar is a really great team. They're pretty far in their development. They've raised the most money in the Urbit ecosystem. Yeah, so they have a development suite. So you can see here, this is kind of like where they're at with test nets, and you know, you see Explorer. So yeah, it's very cool. They've also built Pongo. Pongo is kind of like Telegram-like thing that's running on Urbit. So another one is Holium. Now, when you saw before, I was showing landscape, right? This user interface that Klon is building for Urbit, it doesn't quite feel like an operating system, right? It feels like a web application. And Holium really focuses on user experience. And so, for example, they have a desktop application on Mac OS, and this is what it looks like. It actually looks like an operating system. So it's a different interface for Urbit. And yeah, they're focusing a lot on like some interesting collaborative feature. They want to build things so that like DAOs can use this kind of thing to like collaborate with each other. So very cool, and I think they're very strong on the kind of UX side. Yeah, so Red Horizon, so this is us basically, right? So we have now been working on Urbit hosting an infrastructure for a year. So really trying to focus on how can we host people's servers, you know, at scale, right? So when there will be, you know, millions of Urbit users one day, hopefully. And, you know, we also have been working on having, or we have built a developer API to allow people who develop Urbit applications to kind of easily onboard people onto hosting and getting their planet, you know, without having to go somewhere else if they don't have a planet yet. So we're working, for example, with Uqbar, so that when people that onboarding onto their development tools and stuff, that we provide the Urbit service for them. Yeah, we'll talk in a little bit about how, you know, anybody who wants to get on Urbit, at the moment we're hosting everything for free. Yeah, so this is kind of the web interface for our hosting thing, right? But then when you launch, you get into landscape, so then you're back fully on Urbit. But this is sort of the, you know, the normal web interface for that. Yeah, so for Web3 developers, I think Urbit is a super interesting thing to explore. Personally, I expect this world will come together. At the moment, the communities are sort of separate. You know, if you go to an Urbit event, a lot of people are like really into Urbit and don't necessarily care that much about blockchain. I would say probably like 70% are like just Urbit enthusiasts, maybe 30% are like Urbit and blockchain. But I think we're really going to see this merger where it's going to become super relevant. I think the value proposition for Urbit for developers is going to be super compelling, because as a developer, you can develop your application and you ship your application, and you don't have to host a front end. You don't have, you're not responsible for infrastructure, right? So you don't have to have a DevOps team. You don't have to have an AWS account or, you know, server infrastructure. So I think this is going to be like super attractive. Like it will mean that developers will be able to build applications used by loads of people without such large teams without necessarily having to make money also, right? Because they don't have the infrastructure cost. So it's very attractive. And then, of course, you have access to these Urbit OS primitives like, messaging, authentication, storage, Urbit ID, and yeah, and you have a really brilliant technical community as well. So yeah, if you want to get involved, so first of all, yeah, as I mentioned, right, we are hosting Planet. So you can get a Planet and Urbit ID for free. You can just go in there and you can onboard. And yeah, we are most likely, I think we will continue hosting Planets for free. And at some point, probably there will be some sort of thing where, if there's like more usage or maybe there will be extra paid things, who knows, I don't know. But at least for the next year, I think it's going to be, and then the Urbit ID anyway will be used forever. Otherwise, if you want to get involved, there's a bunch of other things. So first of all, there's a thing called Hoon School Live. So Hoon School Live is run by a really cool guy. He was a sort of nuclear physics professor. And very old school professor, he feels like, and he's been running this. And he's now fully working on Urbit education. He works for the Urbit Foundation now, and he has a developer course. Actually, he has a bunch of developer courses. So there's Hoon School Live, which is a sort of introductory course, over like 3 months or something. It runs 4 times a year, maybe. To basically teach people, fundamentals of Urbit development and of the Urbit language. There's also App School Live, which is a more advanced thing where it comes to building Urbit applications. So that's available for free, and it's a really great sort of educational offering. You also go to urbit.org, right? There's lots of documentation, information there. And yeah, you can start building dApps on Urbit. I think worth checking out Ukbar too. They're progressing quickly and getting to the point where you can really build like smart contract applications on Urbit. And also Urbit Assembly. So this is the main Urbit conference once a year. Last year it was in Miami, and this year is going to be in Lisbon. I think probably like 500 people-ish or something like that will be coming. And so yeah, it's October 28th, 29th. It's a really great event. And there's going to be also sort of Urbit week then too, so where there'll be other events and meetups, I think the week following the conference. So yeah, if people want to get involved, highly recommend it. You can also contact me. So once you're on the network, right, my Urbit ID is minwike.dablin, and you can just message, or you can just send me an email too. Maybe briefly to say what's best to do on Urbit like right now. So when you get your Planet, there should be pre-installed an app called Portal. So it's an Urbit application that focuses on discovery. Because on Urbit, the applications would be hosted on different people's server. Any Urbit server can host and distribute an Urbit application. So there's no global view of like what are the applications. And same thing for groups, right? Anyone can organize a group on their server, host it. So there's no global view for that. So Portal focuses sort of on discovery. They're trying to help you find things on Urbit. Portal is still early, but it's a great team, and I think that they're doing some good work. So we pre-installed that on the Planet, and the main thing to do right now is probably groups on Urbit, right? There's very active groups with hundreds of members about all kinds of topics, right? From technical to so I think finding some groups on Urbit is probably the best thing to do at the moment, besides trying to build something. So I don't know. Is there any time for questions or 5 minutes? Okay, then yeah, let's do some questions.
Very concrete. Is it possible to run Urbit on an Android app, so downloading it from an app store and running the Urbit OS inside Android in that way?
So if you can run Urbit on an Android phone?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's going to work particularly well. And I think it's too, I think it is too intensive in terms of resources and stuff like that. You can certainly run it on a computer, But on a phone, I think the expectation is not that you will run the full Urbit on a phone, but more that like maybe you will run it on some server and then your phone will connect to that. Maybe there will be in the future some. Maybe it could. We'll see. But yeah, I think it's not the way that people run Urbit at this point, at least. Maybe the mic for yeah.
How do you distribute an application Urbit? Do you just, like, let's say I'm a developer and I've created an Urbit application and then I want other people to like download it on their Urbit servers and use it. Do you just host it on your own Urbit server and people just download it from there, or?
Yeah, exactly. You will host it on your own Urbit server, and then if we see here, you have like get Urbit apps, right? So when you will click on that, then it will basically, you will type in there like the name or some Urbit ID, basically some Urbit server, right? So for example, you could type in like the name of your planet if you're hosting it there, and then it will show you, it will list all of the applications that are hosted on your server, right? So that's how you kind of download it. Now, of course, that still leaves the problem of, well, how do I know about your application, right? So I think that's kind of the problem of discovery. Which Portal is trying to solve, and there could be different ways of solving it. But yeah, basically all people will need to know is like what is the name of the server, right, where your application is. They'll just type it in. It will the peer-to-peer network will connect to your server, list all the applications. They can click on it and download it.
Oh, then the problem of discovery kind of creates an opportunity for a parallel platform, let's say outside Urbit, that just like is centralized and like stores the list of all applications that are on the Urbit network.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the problem of discovery is an important one, right? So Portal is trying to do that. Portal is also an Urbit application, but they, for example, have also the idea, or maybe they would make like a clear website, right, normal website where you could see the Urbit applications. And yeah, so I think discovery is, it's still early. I mean, maybe people have built like 100 Urbit applications, something like that, but mostly it's like developers building some demo thing. Actually, like kind of more mature Urbit application, there isn't that much. But yeah, I think the discovery, I think, is an important topic, and people will be able to build all kinds of different app stores, competing app stores. They can all list the same apps. So I think app stores makes one, but there could be other types of discovery. Like, for example, if you're connected with different Urbit, you have a bunch of peers, like contacts, basically, right? Like you could, for example, say, okay, I allowed my contacts to see what applications I have. Then maybe you could see, all my contacts, what applications they have, what am I interested in. So yeah, I think I'm sure there will be lots of experimentation around this as well.
Could also build a sort of torrent system on top of Urbit to like speed up downloads and things like that.
Totally, you could. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Maybe one more question, if anyone has one.
So, is there any mechanism for app developers to get paid?
Yeah, great question. I mean, you could basically try to charge people just for the application, right? So I'm building an application, and then you're downloading the application from me, and I'm charging you for that, right? And so I could, for example, have an application that's kind of I ship to you the machine code, and I basically modify it so that it runs only on your particular server, right? Of course, it still leaves somebody could take it, strip it out, pirate it and stuff like that. But at least I think you could reasonably elegantly say, I'm going to charge people for per download or per user. So that's one thing. I mean, I think smart contract stuff with Ukbar, tokens, there will be other ways, but it's an unexplored field. Like right now, there's no Urbit application is really at the point where they're monetizing. So yeah, but I think there will be lots of possibilities, including just the possibility like, charge per download, I think will work reasonably well on Urbit. Cool. Then thanks so much, everyone.